And welcome to another edition of Book Talk, coming to you from the Benjamin L. Hook Central Library. I'm Stephen Usry, and we're joined today by Les Standiford and Joe Matthews. Thank you so much for stopping by, gentlemen.
Thank you for inviting us.
It's a pleasure.
Les Standiford is the Director of Creative Writing at Florida International University and is the author of 20 books, including the John Deal Mystery Series and best-selling nonfiction like The Man Who Invented Christmas, Washington Burning, and Last Train to Paradise. Joe Matthews is a retired sergeant detective with 30 years on the Miami Beach Police Department. He's currently a consultant and CEO of LifePrint DNA Incorporated. Les and Joe are here today to talk about their book, Bringing Adam Home, The Abduction That Changed America, and it's now available from Echo HarperCollins. Les, it's really hard to believe that the disappearance of a little boy 30 years ago could have such a huge impact on our country today.
Well, this is a case where there's no hype or exaggeration in the book subtitle. This case really did change America. Before Adam Walsh went missing, there were no such things as children's faces on milk cartons or on billboards. There were no Amber Alerts. There were no Code Adam alerts in big box retailers. There was no National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There was no Adam Walsh Child Protection Act. Those are just a few of the things that have changed in the wake of the case. Joe likes to say that the Adam Walsh case is to missing and exploited children issues in this country as 9/11 was to airport and national security practices.
Now, even though Wayne Williams had just been arrested several weeks before Adam's disappearance, national attention and vigilance for children wasn't really high at that time.
Not at all. It was said at the time that Adam went missing that it was easier to get the FBI to investigate the case of a stolen horse or a car than it was to get them to look into a child's disappearance. Part of that had to do with politics. The FBI preferred to stay out of it because it was their thinking that so often that a missing child turns up or has been abducted by a parent or a family member. That kind of thing isn't the type of crime they're well equipped to deal with. But even if there are only 100 what we call classic kidnappings in the United States in a year, and that's just about what it is, whereas 850,000 kids are reported missing, even if you're just one of those few 100, well, statistics don't matter. You need somebody to go looking for your child, not to tell you, well, statistics tell us that this isn't cost effective.
What happened on that late summer day in Hollywood, Florida?
Reve Walsh was going over to the Sears. She took a little boy with her, Adam, 6 years old. And what was customary, and my children did it too, at that same Sears, is they had a video game on display, and they encouraged the parents to allow their children to play on it while the parents went shopping. The irony of it is that Reve was only 2 hours over it in the lamp department. And when you see the crime scene photos of where the video game was, you could actually see all the lighting, department right behind it. And when she went on to check on a lamp that she wanted to buy, Adam was playing with one boy who was 9 years old. His last name was Cockerham. I ended up interviewing him years later. The two of them played the video game until two other boys came in from the street, and they were aggressive, and they wanted to play. There was an altercation between the three boys. Adam is 6 years old. He's very passive. He wasn't involved. And there was a security guard. The security guard was 17 years old, and it was the second day of employment. And the rules were if kids misbehave and the parents aren't in the store with them, you escort them out of the store. She asked the two boys that came in later if their parents were there. They said no. They argued with her. She kicked them out of the store. She asked the older boy if his mother was in the store. He said no, and she assumed that Adam was his brother, so she kicked them both out of the store. And that's where the abduction took place, outside of the Sears store.
He was only 6 years old and standing outside all by himself.
Absolutely. That's exactly what happened.
You learned that your wife had intended to go to that very same store that afternoon.
When I got home from work that night, I heard it on the police broadcast that a little boy was missing. My wife was quite upset. We have 4 children within 5 years, and my oldest son, Joey, is actually 1 day older than Adam Walsh. And she was on the road taking him to Sears. Then she was going to go to the cafeteria, which is right next door to it, for lunch. And she pretty much said that it could have been us.
Now, you worked for the Miami Beach Police Department. How did you get involved with a crime that was the jurisdiction of the Hollywood Police Department?
At the time, I was in charge of homicide for Miami Beach, and I also was the chief polygraph examiner. I had a polygraph school, state-certified school, that I taught law enforcement officers how to become polygraph examiners, and many of my students were Hollywood police and other surrounding departments. So I was known in the area, and when they needed polygraphs, their chief of police called my chief of police and asked if they would allow me to go over there and do the polygraphs and interviews.
Now, with South Florida being kind of a sprawling area with counties against counties and communities against communities, how is interagency operation and cooperation down there?
In most cases, it's good. In most cases, it's very good. In this particular case, even though I had worked with Hollywood on a number of occasions with other detectives, when I went over there and I was introduced to the lead investigator, Jack Hoffman, the lieutenant, as he's introducing, Jack Hoffman never looked up, didn't make eye contact with me, and his first response is, what do we need him here for? We have our own examiners. And I knew it was going to get worse from there, and it did.
No less. John Walsh was a marketing executive for a large resort hotel in southern Florida. And do you think it was that marketing insight that he brought that allowed him to bring a higher profile to his son's disappearance?
Well, I think it was desperation that led him to bring higher profile to his child's experience. I don't know. If you meet him today, very high energy, very bright, very intense guy, and I think he always was. And I think that he was just an articulate fellow, more articulate perhaps than many parents are, but he didn't have a lot of money. He didn't have a lot of influential friends. He was just desperate to find his child, and he's the guy who changed everything. I've written other books about people who have done rather remarkable things, Andrew Carnegie and Charles Dickens among them, and there's a theory in history that circumstances would create an individual to change society in a significant way. And that may be true. In other words, the thinking is if it hadn't been Charles Dickens to write A Christmas Carol, why, somebody else would have come along to write something like it. The age demanded it, but I'll tell you what, the fact remains, in this case, that John Walsh and Reve Walsh are the people who've made these sweeping changes in the way that law enforcement and parents deal with the issue of parenting and missing children.
And what steps did John and Reve take in order to let people know that this was a national issue and just not a local story?
Because they were so flummoxed by the lack of resources. Today, a child goes missing in South Florida or Washington State, it's broadcast almost instantaneously around the entire country. When Adam Walsh went missing in Hollywood, people in Orlando didn't know it happened. People in Jacksonville didn't know it happened. And certainly no one outside the state of Florida knew that it happened. And they were frantic with the thought that he might have been put on a plane and carried away, who knows where, by persons unknown. And they really couldn't get anybody to pay any attention to that. The first thing they did was to try to establish a national clearinghouse where parents who might be faced with such a calamity at least would be able to get advice, and then to put pressure on law enforcement agencies to create regional and national databases where information like this could be shared instantaneously. Those are some of the big things that they saw the crying need for and that they made happen.
One of the interesting things that they did during the actual investigation, we have to realize in 1981, this was before fax machines were even invented, and to get the word out throughout the state of Florida, they had a printing company print up their self-made posters, and they would make 100, 200 at a time, put them in a bundle, and they'd go to the airport, and they would be at the gate of every plane going out and handing them to the captain of the airplane and then ask him to deliver it or have a local policeman pick it up and post them in that city. So they did what we're doing today through fax machines and now email and things like that.
But they did it individually, like people wearing sandwich boards on street corners. Imagine the pathetic nature of that, trying to put your finger in the dike is a comparable action. It's just amazing what they were up against and the desperation that they felt. Terrifying to me.
And the lack of sympathy they got from the Hollywood Police Department was just appalling.
Well, at first, I think Hollywood did everything they could to find the child immediately. They were just in over their head over the investigation. Once the child had been found, once Adam's remains were found, the response was disheartening. To the crime investigation, which is at the center of this book, is the most disheartening aspect.
But the positive thing was the uniformed patrol officers, once they heard a young boy was missing, they had policemen coming in on their days off. They had policemen working over without being compensated and patrolling the streets looking for this boy. The mistake that was made is they picked the wrong investigator with no supervision.
To investigate the killing once it was known that that crime had taken place.
And early on in the book, we know who the perpetrator is that you believe to have killed Adam, but it seems almost the villain of the story in the book is Jack Hoffman.
Everything in that book is gospel. One of the things that publishing company demanded, and less demanded as a biographer, is that I had to prove, beyond any doubt, that the information that I provided was in fact true. And I did that based on the manuscript that I presented to Hollywood police and the actual supplemental reports that were highlighted. So I backed everything up based on actual police reports. It is what it is. If he's the villain, he's the villain. He had, I think, ulterior motives as to why maybe he didn't want to accept Otis Toole as a suspect, and now he's being held accountable for it.
Les, did you speak with Hoffman in your research?
No, Hoffman hasn't been. He hasn't spoken to anybody about the case since the day he retired back in 2002. Even up to a couple of weeks ago when the book was featured on the Today Show. The Today Show reached out to try to ask him if he wanted to present his side of the story, so to speak, to no avail.
Now, Les, you're quite free with your opinions through the book yourself. Why did you choose this approach instead of a more journalistic remove?
Well, I would call it journalism. As Joe said, this is not our theory about what happened. This is an account of how this case was finally solved. And it is backed up. It is a record of Hollywood police procedure, both the lamentable early days and finally what they did after they reviewed the evidence that Joe had put together to clear the case and accept his findings, in essence. Now, what's dramatic about my recreation of this crime, it is a real, in my mind, a kind of real-life Columbo episode, where, as you were saying, you get the sense that you know who might have done this, but you can't for the life of you understand how one man is going to do what hundreds of cops before him, including the FBI and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, were not interested in doing. That certainly is a good question. And all I did, essentially, was arrange the material in a form that I thought would strike readers as dramatic. I didn't change a thing. I didn't invent any dialogue. It's all out of the files or out of direct interviews in my mind. So it may be dramatic, but I think it's still journalistic.
Well, at times it seems it's a bit more frank and maybe a bit snarky than you would get in a newspaper report.
Well, I think that people have talked about the difference between new journalism and traditional journalism since Tom Wolfe came on the scene. And when you write a book, you certainly do have a lot more words at your disposal than you do when you're writing even a magazine piece. We've got 100,000 words here. That's 100 times more than what a journalist usually has when he sits down to or she to sit down and write a story. And I stand by everything that's in that book. I can tell you that much.
Otis Toole, just an unfortunate assemblage of tragic youth, diminished mental capacity, and psychopathic behavior. He confesses to the crime to police in Jacksonville, Florida, 2 years later.
What had happened is his lover, Henry Lee Lucas, was arrested. He was in Texas for a murder that he solely committed. Otis Toole was arrested in Jacksonville for an arson that he was totally responsible for. And there was communication between the two, and Lucas started talking about what he did, and that's when Otis Toole decided to start admitting what he had done. And the first time that it's reported that he actually made a confession was to a Brevard County detective who had interviewed him in reference to a homicide that had taken place in Brevard County, Florida. Otis Toole didn't do that one. But in closing, he said, well, I thought you were going to talk to me about that boy I took from a store in Fort Lauderdale. And he said, Otis, he said, I'm from Brevard County, not Broward County. And then he said, you do something bad? And he said, yeah, kind of bad. I feel bad about it. And it was at that time, after he got just enough information, but he didn't want to do a formal interview because he didn't have the facts, he notified a detective that was working Otis Toole by the name of Buddy Terry. He was a Jacksonville detective. The two of them researched to find out what crime took place. It wasn't on the top of their head to say, oh, that's the Adam Walsh case. And upon researching it, they figured out it was the Adam Walsh. And they contacted Hollywood police after contacting BSO, Fort Lauderdale, and everything else. And they said that the lead investigator should come up there because they felt he just gave a confession. The second call, after another detective from Louisiana got a more detailed confession, totally unrelated to the first, they realized, my God, we called Hollywood 10 days ago, and he never showed up. They called back, and that's when Hollywood showed up.
And Hoffman's treatment of Buddy Terry is just beyond the pale, how he ruined his reputation.
It's quite disturbing. It was self-motivated. He had accused Buddy Terry of giving information. Actually, he accused first the Louisiana detective of giving information to Otis Toole so he could give a false confession. And then he became aggressive and said, what do you mean? You're telling me I planted information on this guy? And then later he accused Buddy Terry of it. During our investigation, I proved beyond any doubt that Otis Toole confided in someone. He did sign a contract for a book, but it was not Buddy Terry. There was nobody involved in the immediate investigation. It wasn't a police officer.
It was a friend for whom he used to work who came to him and said, we can make some money off your story, Otis. Let's write us up a book contract. There was a book contract, but it certainly didn't have anything to do with anybody in law enforcement. Neither of those guys, Jay Villa or Buddy Terry, knew anything about the case when Otis started talking about it. They couldn't have fed anyone any information.
Now, at this time around in Florida, it seems to be a magnet for serial killers. With Ted Bundy, as we learn later, Jeffrey Dahmer had been in the area as well. I don't mean to disparage your state, but it seems that a lot of bad things happened there around that time.
It is what it is.
You know, Florida is a place where a lot of people have come there from elsewhere, seeking a new start or running away from something. It's one of those places that there's a headline every day that could be the stuff of a novel. A lot of crime novelists in South Florida, too, because they grow up and live amidst all that. But it is a diverting coincidence, for instance, that Jeffrey Dahmer lived in Sunny Isles Beach. He was discharged dishonorably from the Army and didn't want to go home to Minnesota, and they said, well, where do you want to go? And he said, I guess Miami. And they did send him down there. Worked for a pizza parlor over on the beach and did live there at the same time that Adam Walsh went missing. And here's a case that went unsolved for 27 years and had such a profound impact on the nation in its way, had an impact on the national psyche equivalent to that of the Kennedy assassination. And when something like that goes unsolved for 27 years, people begin to search for answers themselves and begin to spin their own notions about what might possibly have happened. And then so you get these, oh, well, Jeffrey Dahmer must have done it. He lived here at the time. It is a diverting coincidence, but cops, in fact, when Dahmer was arrested in 1991, Hollywood police and FBI and Minnesota authorities questioned Dahmer, who said, I don't know what you're talking about. I went after young men, not little boys. He had no interest in something like that. He denied it, and no proof was ever found that would substantiate such a notion.
I would guess it's Ted Bundy that's responsible for people having the idea of a serial killer as this kind of more of a mastermind type of high intelligence and charmingness. But with the case of Dahmer and Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, that these men operated very much on the margins of life, and just beyond a native cunning, they really didn't have much going for them.
Otis Toole was analyzed, and he had an IQ of less than 75, borderline retardation, and that's how they identified him back then. But they said he was very street smart, and to survive on the street, you have to be street smart, and that's how he lived. And when he hooked up with Henry Lee Lucas, they just took advantage of every situation that was available to him. And it wasn't to make money, it was to get high on hurting people.
Now, he confessed over and over, many times to many different people, but he did recant a couple of times. Normally when a suspect recants, what's the process the police have to go through in order to establish if they're going to accept the original confession or the recantation?
That's not the decision up to the police. What happens if you do it properly, you conduct the interview after they confess to you. And you do an interview in critiquing this one. They didn't do interviews. They took statements. So they allowed Otis Toole to give a statement. There was no interview, and then an interview was supposed to turn into an interrogation. Neither one was conducted. They just allowed him to be a self-serving statement. So they did one, then he had more to say. They did the second, and then the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and it kept going and going. The proper way of doing it is you do one interview. When I interviewed John Walsh before I polygraphed him, my interview lasted 9 hours. And it's not unusual. Some of my interviews last days and days and days, as long as he's willing to talk to me. And then after you figure out exactly what happened, and you could validate it based on evidence as to what they're saying is true, you take your formal tape-recorded statement. That's what's used for court. In this particular case, they recorded every interview, and every interview there was a conflict. You have to realize, when a policeman first talks to you, in many cases, in most cases, the guy just doesn't, drop the gun and say, okay, I did it. The first thing, he's going to deny any involvement whatsoever and deny having any knowledge. Then after the interview continues and you give him an opportunity to explain himself, then he's going to put himself at the scene, but he wasn't involved. And then he's going to accuse somebody else, but he wasn't involved. Then eventually he's going to say, well, I was driving the car, but I didn't do it. And then eventually, well, I was in the house with him, but I didn't shoot him. And at the final version, okay, I did it, I was by myself. And none of these proper procedures were taken. They allowed others to give statements, and that was a major flaw in the investigation.
One of his recantations took the form of, well, I did that crime, but my attorney says I didn't, so I'm saying I didn't do it. And the cop who heard this took those words down and walked out of the room. Said, I'm tired of talking to this guy.
And he does confess over and over again in the book. It's a very grueling process, just for the reader. No telling how it affected the Walshes.
What's so sad about this whole thing is this case happened in 1981. On November 2nd, 1990, I, on Miami Beach, investigated a homicide of a 3-year-old boy that was 18 pounds, worst case of abuse, neglected, and torture. And John Walsh, originally thinking I was from Hollywood, he bit his tongue because he knew that this case needed, media attention to identify. And he came down and did a reenactment, and we solved the case. Having said that, that particular night, after we did the reenactment, John and I sat down, and that was the first time that John actually talked to a detective that was involved in his son's abduction. And John had never been told, here it was up to 10 years later, of what family members, what friends, what associates were eliminated as suspects in the case. For 10 years, Hollywood never took the time to say, hey, your brother Joe, okay, we did a background on him. We found that he was not involved in any way. Can you imagine to live with that, not knowing who could have been responsible for killing your son and who was eliminated as a suspect?
Among your friends and your family, to never have those people discounted by the cops, what that must do to your mind.
No less, you're not a law enforcement professional, but you've written quite a few mystery novels, and you've investigated the darker side of the human psyche that way. How did you cope in dealing with all this research and all the darkness that's therein?
Well, when Joe first presented this material to me, I looked at him as if he were one of the characters from one of my novels suddenly materialized before my eyes. And it was a rare opportunity, I think, for someone who's written crime fiction. I'd written 10 novels before I turned to historical narrative. And here came another piece of history, but relatively recent history, and it had a story that it was better than anything I might have dreamed up. In fact, had I put some of the things in that took place in the course of this investigation into one of my novels, I suspect people would have said that I had exceeded the bounds of credibility. That's how far some of this stuff goes. What a joy it was to combine that crime writing past with the history writing present and try to tell a real life story that was just as good as anything anyone could imagine.
How did you come to meet Joe?
We were introduced by Mitchell Kaplan, a man who runs a series of bookstores in South Florida. Joe had gone to Mitchell Kaplan's father, who was at one time the attorney for the Fraternal Order of Police over in Miami Beach. He defended cops who got in trouble, not that Joe ever got in any trouble, but he went asking for Joe for an author, and You might want to tell that story, John.
I met Joe Kaplan, and I said to him, I hear your son's an author. But let me go back before that. When Hollywood and the state attorney had decided to close the case and told John and Reve Walsh, it was Reve that said to me, Joe, we have to publish your manuscript to law enforcement. They have to know the good, the bad, and the ugly so these mistakes aren't made again. And I promised her I'd get it done. Being so naive about the industry of publishing a book, I thought it would just be an easy thing to do. Found the name of a publishing company out of New York that was the largest publisher of criminal justice books. I talked to the woman in charge of that division, left a half a dozen calls. She never returned my call. I ended up talking to the editor-in-chief of the publishing company. To me, he said, well, go ahead and mail it to me. He said, but I can't promise that I'll read it other than, it'd take me at least 6 months before I even get to it. I said, I don't care how long it takes you. Just read it. And a couple of days later, he called me back. He said, my God, I never read anything like it. Now, it wasn't the kind of reading that you would enjoy reading. It's police reports. But he said, I'm going to do you the biggest favor anyone could ever do for you. And I said, what's that? And I thought it was a slam dunk. He was going to publish it. He said, I'm not going to publish it. He said, because it wouldn't do justice to the investigation, the book. It wouldn't reach enough people. It wouldn't be cost-effective for people to even buy the book. It would be cost-prohibitive. And he said, you have to find yourself an author that writes facts, that you could communicate with, that you trust. That's when I went to Joe Kaplan, and his son, Mitchell Kaplan, said to me, I can find you an author, but the one I want to write this book is Les Standiford. And when I met Les, we talked for a couple hours, and he said, I'll read this and I'll get back to you. And when I got home, I told my wife, I said, I hope to God he does it because that's the guy I want to write the book. I just felt that positive. And we worked on it for over 2 years and never doubted it once.
Now, I would like to have a bit of comic relief in the episode just because it is such a serious topic. If you could tell us about the time when you were training to become a police officer and your pistol went missing.
Oh, my God. I could tell you more than that. First of all, it was a Miami-Dade Police Academy, and there was only 5 of us from Miami Beach. And we always considered, because Miami Beach paid more, even though we only made $500 a month, we still got more than most other departments. There was little animosity, not amongst the other policemen that were in the academy, but the instructors who worked for Miami-Dade. Now they got to teach Miami Beach, too. So the tolerance level for us, I think, wasn't as much as it should have been. But then again, I made some, monumental mistakes, one of which was that I put on day lock, my locker where I kept my gun and my equipment, and that means, that you could turn it just to the final number and it opens up real quick, so I don't have to waste my time going through all 3 numbers. And during the middle of the academy, I opened up my locker, and oh my God, I thought I was going to die. My gun was missing. I saw an empty holster, and at first I didn't know what to do. And I realized, I had no other choice but to report it. And I reported it to Sergeant Grant, who was in charge of the academy at the time, and he just went off on me. He just yelled and screamed, and I'm sure he said a lot of things that Les didn't even put in print. Then he called the chief of the corrections division of the sheriff's department, and he said that the trustees are the ones that clean that locker, so therefore they have to do a strip search and they have to clean out all the cells of all Dade County Jail. And he's repeating everything that Chief Sandstrom is telling him, and it's going back and forth. And I'm just standing there at attention listening to him having this conversation. And after he cursed me and said he's probably going to fire me if I didn't find my gun, he said, so you better find it. And I walked out, and it was lunchtime, and my first instinct was, nobody's going to just take that gun. I wanted to verify if, in fact, Sergeant Grant talked to the chief. So during my lunch period, I went over to the jail, and I asked to speak to the chief of the jail. And even the secretaries, they said, you're in green, which means I was a cadet. Are you sure you want to speak to him? He was the top guy. And I said, yes, ma'am. I went in his office, and when I asked him, sir, did Sergeant Grant call you today and say they had to do a strip search and search, for my gun? He said, what gun? What are you talking about? I went on to explain everything to him, and he pretty much told me, he said, he's a jerk. Of course he didn't do that. I said, thank you, sir. So when I went back and he started, yelling at me, and I just responded. Now, luckily for myself, I didn't repeat what the major said about him, the chief said about him, but I just said, sir, it's not as bad as you think. I think I have a suspect. And he said, you have a suspect? Well, who's your suspect? Well, I said, you. Oh, my God, he really got upset. But the bottom line is, I went back to my locker a couple hours later, and the gun was back in there, and I didn't get fired.
How much do you think police work, in particular, could be improved without just the politics?
Let's talk about today's policemen. I really admire today's policemen. I think they're probably the most educated that we've ever had. I think they're probably the most stable that we've ever had. They're watched, so we don't have the problems that we had when I was a young cop of guys having alcohol drinking problems. When those problems are identified, they're immediately addressed. I never wanted my boys to be police officers. I never wanted my daughter to ever date a cop. But at the end of the day, my 4 children are all adults. 2 sons are police officers, and my daughter is married to a detective sergeant who works homicide. And they're doing an unbelievable job, not just my kids, but all the cops, because it's zero tolerance for misbehaving and lying and cheating. And if the problem is identified, it's addressed immediately.
Another thing, in cases like those of Adam Walsh, there is a playbook. There is a code Adam for stores. A child reported missing, the doors are locked. People know what to do. Before this happened, they didn't know what to do, and particularly small agencies like Hollywood PD, they were in over their head to begin with. Today, it would be the rare department that would not seek out help. At least it would be the rare department that would not know how to seek out help when it was needed.
As society in general, we have Amber Alerts and Megan's Law and the Center for Missing and Exploited Children. But what else could we do to help with these problems?
One question is asked to me, what should a parent do to protect their children? And the one answer I have is communication, communication, communication. What the problem is today is parents are too busy. Both parents are working. They have nannies or they have babysitters, and they come home just in time to tuck their kids in, and the next day drive them to school. To eliminate future problems, you have to have a relationship with your child so you understand them, and they feel comfortable talking to you, not to a stranger. And my advice is, when you are talking to your child, respond, don't react. After you get all the information, you could always react later, but don't react and put an end to the conversation. The second thing is, one of the passions that John Walsh has and I have is, as a result of the baby lollipop case, this child had been in social service custody for 4 months and had no record of it. So I developed a home DNA identification kit, and we try to get a bill passed. I testified before Senate subcommittees and everything, and we try to get baby lollipop bill passed, which would mandate social services to take a DNA sample of the children that they take into custody. And we weren't successful. But then John said to me, just because we couldn't get a law passed doesn't mean you can't do it yourself. I said, John, I'm a cop. I'm not a social worker. I love my kids, but I don't deal with other kids. And he said, but you know how important this is. Since that time, 1996, it's been endorsed by John, and there's no personal gain anyway for John. And we do child safety events all over the country. It's called DNA Life Print. And we do the biometric fingerprinting. We do digital colored photo, and we do a home DNA kit. And we do a questionnaire that has 50 questions that a mother would ask their child at their leisure. Questions that, when a child goes missing, you have no idea. You may think your little boy's favorite hiding place is in the master closet, but it might be behind the shed. You might think his favorite place to visit is SeaWorld, but it might be Disney World if he's a runaway. So this is all one packet that is through a corporate sponsor. They pay it all, and it's free to the community. So God forbid your child goes missing. And like Les said before, 90-something% of all missing children are either runaway or parental abductions. Then you have the packet right there. It's all inclusive. You just hand it to the police, and the DNA is CODIS compatible, which is the FBI data bank. And the 10-digit fingerprints, which is biometric fingerprints, is compatible with the FBI data bank. So it's a win-win. It's a win for the corporate sponsor, giving back to the community, and it's a win to the community, getting it totally free of charge and having the peace of mind, knowing that their child, not identified, but being traced. That's what's so important. Right now, you and I are talking, and I see I could get DNA off that microphone you're talking into. I could get the DNA off your telephone, off the keys of your computer. So it's easy to extract DNA, but if you don't have a sample of your child's or loved one's DNA to do a comparative analysis, what good is it? So it eliminates outside issues. It eliminates if you have a suspect vehicle and you know for sure the child was in that car, then you can focus all your attention on that car, and then instead of leading the other 100 leads.
And certainly technology is available today that probably would have shortened the time that it took to solve this case. Had we had those resources in 1983, there's a strong likelihood that even with slipshod police work, still Otis Toole would have been convicted of the crime 27 years ago.
Les, you've been a prolific author in the past, so it's hard to believe that you don't have something else in the works right now.
We've talked about a follow-up to this case. I think after working with Joe for a couple of years, I think that he could find out where Amelia Earhart and Judge Crater went, and so that might be the next thing. Now, I have another book that I had promised to the publisher when Joe and I met, and I talked the publisher into waiting a couple of years for me to get back to work on that, and has to do with the radical American groups that were involved in leading us up to the brink of the revolution in 1776.
Well, we look forward to seeing that in the near future.
So do I.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for stopping by and sharing your time and bringing Adam home with us.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it very much.
Bringing Adam Home, The Abduction That Changed America, is by Les Standiford and Joe Matthews, and it's available from Echo HarperCollins. I'm Stephen Usry, and this is Book Talk.
Thank you for joining us today. Book Talk is recorded in the studios of WYPL in Memphis, Tennessee. If you have any questions or comments, you can email us at wyplfm@gmail.com or write to us at Book Talk, care of WYPL, 3030 Poplar Avenue, Memphis, Tennessee, 38111, or call us at 901-415-2752. You can find information on upcoming tapings and broadcasts of Book Talk, as well as download podcasts at our blog, wyplfmbooktalk.blogspot.com.
This recording of Book Talk is licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivative Works 3.0 license for the United States. You are free to share, copy, distribute, or display and perform this work, but there are restrictions. Number 1, you must attribute the work to WYPL Radio of Memphis, Tennessee. Number 2, you may not use this work for commercial purposes. And number 3, no derivative works are allowed. You may not transform, alter, or build upon this work. For any reuse or distribution of this work, you must make clear to others the license terms of the work. Any of the previous conditions can be waived if you get permission from WYPL Radio. And nothing in this license impairs or restricts WYPL's moral rights. Thank you for listening to Book Talk.